My dad said I was an illiterate cleaner before I even sat down. He said it the way some people comment on the weather, casual and public, and meant to be heard. I was still holding my napkin when he added that I did not deserve a seat at this table. The table being the long, polished one he loved to brag about, now filled with relatives in their winter best and business partners who had come expecting a civilized Christmas dinner. I felt the room shift, the way a room does when someone breaks a rule so cleanly that everyone else freezes for a second, waiting to see if they misheard. They had not. Mom did not bother looking at me. She was focused on smoothing the sleeve of her red silk dress as she said I was worth nothing. Her tone made it sound like she was reading a line item off a budget report. Lydia started laughing quietly, not the kind that bursts out, but the kind someone saves for a moment they have been waiting for. It was a thin, satisfied sound, the kind that floats just enough for people to pretend not to hear. Dad pulled my chair back an inch with 2 fingers and pointed toward the kitchen. Go be useful if you want to be here at all. His voice carried past the candles and the roasted ham and the expensive plates he rented every year to impress the same group of men who had now gone silent. All 12 of them, the cousins, the neighbors, the 2 men from his company, even the old family friend who always drank too much wine for dessert. They all stayed silent. I did not say anything. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I tucked the napkin on the table, stood up and walked to the kitchen the way someone walks to a place they need to already know too well. A place for people who do not belong in the room where decisions are made. The room where people like Julian Mercer sat. Julian was seated near the midpoint of the table, angled slightly away from the wall so he could see everything. He had been polite when he arrived earlier, nodding to me the same way he nodded to everyone, the practiced courtesy of a man used to being watched. When Dad began talking, Julian had set down his fork slowly. Not dramatically, just slow enough that anyone paying attention could tell he did not expect them. Evening to turn this direction. In the kitchen, the heat from the oven pressed against my face. Someone had pulled a batch of rolls out too early, and the air smelled like flour that had not finished becoming bread. I stood near the counter, the place Dad always sent me when I visited, as if wiping a surface made me useful, as if standing near soap and steam made me less visible. I could still hear the dining room. It was only 20 feet away. Lydia's voice carried first, something about how she had always known I would embarrass the family, eventually. Someone else murmured a response, a sympathetic little sound. Then chairs shifted, silverware clinked, and the dinner continued. Just like that. Cruelty folded back under celebration, smoothed over with cranberry glaze and empty conversation. I leaned against the counter and listened to my own breathing. It was even, controlled. I wondered for a moment if shock was supposed to feel warmer. Mine felt cold, quiet, almost steady. From where I stood, I could see reflections in the glass door of the oven. Not faces, just shapes moving back and forth. One of them separated from the rest, paused, then stepped closer to the doorway. Julian. I recognized the outline of his suit, the way he carried his shoulders as if he was always half prepared for someone to ask him a question he had not been warned about. He did not walk into the kitchen. He simply stood at the threshold. The dining room had dimmed again, not in lights, but in energy. The way a room folds in on itself when something uncomfortable has happened, and no one wants to acknowledge it. He said my name the way he always did at his place. Calm, expectant, natural, as if I were supposed to answer him in Arabic, as if this kitchen were simply another Tuesday morning hallway at his home, where I spent hours doing work no one else knew about. I froze for half a breath. Not because of fear, because of recognition. For a second, he had forgotten where we were. That was how deeply the pattern ran. I answered him in English, quietly. Yes, sir. The moment cracked open between us. He looked at me fully then, and I could tell he registered the mistake he had made. A small shift in his eyes, barely visible, but enough to say he understood 2 things at the same time. 1, I did not belong in that kitchen. 2, I had been put there on purpose. Before he could speak again, someone called his name from the table. His attention slid away like a door closing. He held my gaze for a second longer, then turned back to the dining room. I stayed where I was, letting the heat from the oven anchor me in place. A staff member brushed past me carrying a tray of vegetables. She did not look at me either. No one ever looked at the person who had been sent away. I reached for a towel and wiped the counter, though it did not need wiping. The motion steadied me. I had learned over the years that sometimes the smallest repetitive task kept my mind from spinning in 3 different directions. Wipe, breathe, think. Wipe again. I was not thinking about the humiliation, not directly. I was thinking about the pattern, how many years it had taken for my family to craft this version of me, how many times I had agreed to sit quietly in the name of peace. I pressed the towel flat and stared at my hands. Clean hands. Steady hands. The hands Dad said were only useful for scrubbing someone else's dirt. Behind me, I heard someone laugh a little too loudly at one of Dad's jokes. He always told the same 3 stories whenever new business associates joined us. 2 involved golf. The last one involved the time he allegedly saved his department by finding a missing contract everyone else had overlooked. A story which was mostly untrue. He did not find anything. I had. Back then I was 17 and trying too hard to make him proud. I had stayed up until 1 in the morning searching through old email archives because he had mentioned at dinner that he was stressed about losing a document. When I handed it to him the next morning, he said good and walked away. He told everyone else he had done it himself. I remember thinking that maybe he forgot I was the one who gave it to him. Now I know better. A wave of cold air slipped into the kitchen as someone opened the back door. It smelled like pine trees and exhaust. Christmas night in North Carolina always felt like winter and fall were arguing about whose turn it was. I almost welcomed the cold. It cut through the heaviness on my chest. I heard Lydia's voice again drifting from the dining room. She was telling someone that the degrees I once pursued had been a phase, that I bounced from one interest to another, that cleaning suited me better. She said it lightly, almost playfully, but there was a satisfaction underneath her tone. Lydia liked certainty, especially when she was the one writing the story. The room quieted again. I knew the rhythm of our family gatherings well. My dad liked to make a speech before dessert. It was his way of marking territory, claiming the room. When he stood up this time, I felt it in the shift of voices. He was thanking everyone for coming. A warm welcome to the neighbors, a nod to his business partners for joining a family evening despite their schedules. A soft laugh about how he hoped the ham turned out as well as last year. He sounded gracious, charming. The version of himself he saved for outsiders. Then he pivoted. I heard my name, spoken too casually. She is in the kitchen where she is most comfortable. A pause, a murmur of confusion from a few guests. Then he continued. She has never been much for thinking. She does better with her hands. I stopped wiping the counter. My hand hovered above the towel now. The heat from the oven made my face feel too warm. Lydia laughed again. Mom sighed in that long, tired way she used when she wanted sympathy. I breathed in slowly. 1, 2, 3. I kept my back to the doorway. I had learned the hard way that turning around made things worse. If you turned around, someone could call it defiance. Then something else happened. The room fell quiet. Not politely quiet, sharply quiet. The kind that lands like a dropped glass. Julian's voice cut through the air. Not loud, just steady. Where is she? 3 words. Meant for someone at the table. I could imagine him sitting straighter, his fork untouched on his plate. I knew that voice. It was the voice he used in meetings when someone underestimated a number he had already checked twice. Someone answered him, but I could not make out the words. The chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A few seconds passed, then footsteps. I placed the towel back on the counter. My heartbeat felt oddly slow. Not fear, something else, something colder. Julian appeared again at the doorway, this time fully facing me. His expression showed nothing to the others behind him, but I recognized the questions forming behind his eyes. He was piecing things together faster than anyone else in the room. He said my name again, softly this time. Not in Arabic. In English, with intent. I stood straight, waiting. He opened his mouth to speak, but someone behind him interrupted. One of my dad's business partners, asking if everything was all right. Julian did not answer. Not immediately. He kept looking at me as if he were seeing two versions of me at the same time, the one he knew and the one this family had created. My dad stepped behind him and rested a hand on the back of a chair. His voice had that performative friendliness he used when he felt judged. She helps out in the kitchen. It is what she is good at. The word good hung in the air for a second too long. Julie Fine looked away from me. When he spoke, his tone was even. I asked her a question earlier. I did not get an answer. Dad laughed, pretending to be confused. Oh, that. She always needs direction. She gets lost easily. I felt the cold again, this time deeper. Someone called for dessert. Silverware clattered. The conversation resumed. But it did not recover fully. Not after that. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the noise flatten into something distant. I thought about the seat I was not allowed to have, the story they had written for me, and the truth is sitting quietly inside me, waiting. People think humiliation is the breaking point. It is not. The real breaking point is realizing you were never meant to be seen in this first place. That night, I understood something clearly. This was not just an insult. This was erased, and erasure in front of the wrong man. The part that comes next did not begin at that Christmas table at all. It began years earlier, long before anyone called me an illiterate cleaner. Back when numbers were the only thing in my life that made sense. If you want to understand why that night unfolded the way it did, you have to understand how I learned to read what other people never saw. In 2012, I was 20, sitting in a lecture hall at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, staring at a whiteboard covered in what looked like a mess of curved lines and probability notations. Most people around me groaned when the professor started talking about applied economics. I felt something inside me settle. It was the first time I realized numbers were not abstractions. They were conversations. If you looked long enough, they told you what people planned to do before they did it. I was not a loud student. I sat in the third row from the back, took notes in cramped handwriting, and stayed after class only when I needed clarity about something that did not quite balance. My professor once said I had a strange way of seeing things, as if I was always trying to figure out the motive behind the math. I would not call it a gift. It was closer to survival. If you grew up in a family where people said one thing and did another, you learned to read patterns fast. By 2014, I could look at a spreadsheet and see an argument forming. By 2015, I understood how cash flow revealed panic long before anyone admitted it. By 2016, I was interning with a regional consulting firm, helping small businesses figure out why they were losing money. I liked problem solving. I liked the anonymity. What I did not like was the way my family reacted when I talked about it. My dad said economics sounded like guesswork with numbers. Mom said things like she did not know why I bothered when Lydia had already found her path in marketing. Lydia told people I studied something theoretical, which I think was her polite way of admitting she did not understand it at all. I stopped talking about it eventually. It was easier. When I graduated in 2016, I came home for what I thought would be a temporary break before applying to graduate programs. He had just taken on a new project for the family business. He said if you're here, you might as well be useful. I remember the way he handed me a stack of reports. Unceremonious, like passing someone a salt shaker. I did what he asked because back then, I still believed being useful was the fastest way to be seen. The family business operated from an office above a warehouse on the east side of Charlotte. Fluorescent lights hummed, the air smelled faintly like cardboard, and the desks were mismatched from estate sales. My workspace was a corner table next to a filing cabinet with a broken handle. Lydia's office looked like it belonged in a magazine. Glass desk, framed awards, the soft hum of an air purifier. She gave tours of her space. No one ever asked to see mine. My job was simple on paper. Build financial models, analyze risk, prepare presentations. My job in practice was simpler. Do the work, hand it over, and then stand quietly off to the side while someone else delivers it. I remember the first major analysis I did for him. It was a project involving 3 vendors and a contract that would lock the company into a multi-year commitment. He wanted a clean summary he could show potential partners. I spent 6 hours building out scenarios, calculating downside risk, and writing a recommendation that saved the business $70,000. Lydia walked by my desk twice that day wearing heels that clicked like punctuation marks. She poked her head in near 5 in the afternoon, glanced at my screen, and said, "He is waiting. Bring whatever you have." She did not say thank you. She never did. I printed the packet and carried it to his office. He flipped through the pages quickly, nodded once, and said, "Good. Let your sister handle the room." I opened my mouth to ask a question, something small and reasonable, but he was already walking out to the conference table where people were waiting. I followed behind out of habit and took a seat near the back. I watched Lydia pick up the packet I had printed. She did not read it before speaking. She never read anything before speaking. She talked with that bright, confident tone people mistake for competence. She gestured at the charts I had designed and explained scenarios she had not calculated. Everyone nodded. He looked proud. No one glanced toward the back of the room where I sat. After the meeting, she placed the packet on the table and walked out without picking it up. A cleaning crew would probably throw it away later. I gathered the pages and slid them into a folder. I told myself it did not matter who presented the work. Only the work mattered. I believed that longer than I should have. 2 months later, another analysis was needed. Then another. I wrote them all. He began introducing Lydia as the strategic mind of the company. She smiled every time he said it. People asked her questions about projections she did not understand. She would tilt her head toward me slightly, a tiny flick of her eyes, and I would answer from the corner as quietly as possible. Afterward, she would thank the group for the thoughtful discussion. Not me, never me. By 2017, I had stopped expecting credit. I thought silence was maturity, a way of keeping the family together, but that was not what silence is. Silence is erasure in slow motion. There was one particular afternoon in early spring when he called me into his office. Lydia was already there, sitting in the chair closest to his desk. On the table were several printed binders prepared for a meeting with a bank. I recognized my own formatting instantly. I had spent a full week preparing those binders and had emailed them to him the night before. He slid one toward me and said, "Take a look." I opened the cover. The analysis was mine. The charts were mine. The recommendations were mine. But the author page at the front said, "Prepared by Richard Ward." His name, not the company name. My throat went tight. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I remember tapping the corner of the page with my thumb, trying to decide whether to say something. Lydia was adjusting her necklace in the reflection of the window. He was already moving on to the next topic. Something about scheduling conflicts and marketing expenses. For a moment, I felt suspended between 2 versions of myself, one who spoke up and one who stayed quiet. I chose the quiet one. Later that evening, I sat in my car outside the office holding the binder in my lap. The parking lot was almost empty. A few streetlights flickered. I flipped to the first chart and traced the lines with my finger. It was like looking at a ghost of myself, my work with someone else's name attached. A story being told without me in it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself families went through strange phases. I told myself all the things people tell themselves when they are afraid of, losing the little acceptance they have been offered. It would take me years to understand that acceptance built on disappearing is not acceptance at all. By 2018, Lydia was being invited to speak at local business luncheons. She quoted analyses I had done. She called them her insights. My dad introduced her as the future of the company. Mom posted pictures of her on social media with captions about brilliance and leadership. I became the shadow behind the slides, the person who made sure every number aligned while someone else took the applause. Then came the moment that shifted everything. It was the late summer of 2019. The company was preparing for its quarterly meeting with a group of investors. I had built a comprehensive package, nearly 60 pages of projections, risk maps, and sensitivity tests. It was the most complex model I had ever created for them. I handed it to my dad in the morning. He nodded without looking up. 2 hours later, I walked past the small conference room and saw my dad, reviewing the printed packet with 2 senior managers. The first page was visible through the glass. I stopped walking. I stared at the name written in bold letters at the top. Prepare by Richard Ward. Again. Something inside me loosened, not snapped, loosened. The way rope gives before it breaks. After the meeting, he waved me in and said, "Good work, kiddo." Investors liked it. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. I nodded. I felt something in my chest shift, like a door that had been wedged shut for years had finally started to open. That night I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the warm air press against my face. The city lights blurred past. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet, all the times I handed over credit like it was expected, all the times I had been the invisible scaffolding holding up a story where I did not appear. I thought about how slowly erasure happens, like water wearing down stone. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the car long after the engine clicked off. The binder was still on the passenger seat. I picked it up and held it against my chest. An odd thing to do, maybe, but in that moment, I needed to feel something solid, something that proved I existed. Inside my apartment, I set the binder on the kitchen counter. The light above the sink flickered as it always did. I touched the cover again. That binder held weeks of thought, sleepless nights, 10 pots of coffee, and a decade of learning how to read numbers the way some people read people. It was not mine anymore. Someone else's name was on it. Someone else was being congratulated. A quiet decision settled in me that night. Not to confront anyone, not yet, but to stop expecting them to see me. To stop believing the story we were telling as a family was honest. Families hide things. Sometimes they hide the people inside them. The next morning, I returned the binder to his desk without a word. He did not look up. Lydia breezed past me in heels and asked if I could tidy up the conference room. I said nothing. She did not wait for an answer. Back then, I did not know how much that moment mattered. I did not know it would be the beginning of the end of my place in the company. I only knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was being erased. And one day, something in me was going to refuse to disappear any further. I just did not know the refusal would come in the form of a billionaire who would one day say my name in a kitchen full of people who thought they already knew exactly who I was. Back then, I was still trying to salvage a life that had already decided it no longer needed me. Leaving the family business was not dramatic. No slam doors, no long speeches. It was quieter than that. My dad called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in late summer. He did not ask me to sit. He said something about restructuring and cost efficiency. Words people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something unreasonable. Lydia stood behind him, pretending to look at an email on her phone. I understood. I was being pushed out. Not because I failed, because I had become unnecessary to the story they were telling. I packed up the few things I kept on my desk. A mug with a chipped rim, a notebook filled with notes only I could decipher, a calculator I bought in 2014 with money from my first tutoring job. No one said goodbye. People looked at me with the same expression you give someone who has been edited out of a picture. Soft pity, quick averted eyes. Charlotte in early autumn can be cruel when you suddenly find yourself unemployed. The heat hangs on longer than it should. The humidity sticks to your skin and makes everything feel heavier. I spent the first week applying for analyst positions, entry-level roles, mid-level roles, jobs that paid half of what I had made, jobs that paid a third. I did not care about the title. I just wanted a place to land. I heard back from 3 companies. All 3 interviews ended the same way. A polite smile. A nod. A sentence about appreciating my time. Another sentence about not being the right fit. I knew the pattern. Fit was a softer word for something sharper. Fit meant someone had already made a phone call. Fit meant someone had already told them I was not worth the trouble. By the time the 3rd rejection came, I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop on East Boulevard. The sun was too bright. My phone battery was at 9%. My checking account balance was lower than I wanted to admit. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and let my breath fog the chrome. Space between me and the leather. That was the moment I realized something that should have been obvious. I had no network of my own. I had only ever had my family's network, which meant I had nothing now. I spent the next few days walking the Dilworth neighborhood trying to think. I walked past stores selling overpriced candles and women in designer leggings, carrying cold brew coffee. I walked past construction sites and heard people shouting over machinery. For a little while, the noise made me feel less alone. On the 6th day, I found myself standing in front of a small cleaning company on East Tremont Avenue. The sign was simple. No fancy branding. Just a phone number and the owner's name painted in blue. I stared at the door longer than necessary. I could not explain why I walked inside. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because the idea of a job that required no explanation felt like relief. The woman behind the desk asked if I had experience. I told her I cleaned my own apartment. She laughed and said that counted. She asked if I could work evenings or mornings. I said both. She handed me a form. I filled it out. The whole process took 15 minutes. She did not ask why I left my last job. She did not ask for references. She did not ask what my degree was in. She looked at my hands and said, "People with steady hands make good cleaners." I almost cried from the simplicity of it. The pay was hourly, enough to cover rent and groceries, enough to give me a routine. Enough to let me breathe again. My first assignment was a corporate office in South End. I vacuumed floors that already looked clean. I wiped smudges off glass doors. I emptied trash cans that did not smell. At the end of the shift, I sat in my car with sore muscles and a calm mind. There is something honest about physical work. You know what you accomplished because you can see it. People think taking a cleaning job means you failed at something. They are wrong. Cleaning gave me the one thing I had not had in years. A chance to exist without being compared to anyone else. By the second month, I was assigned to private homes on rotation, wealthy clients, uptown condos, houses in Myers Park with gates taller than the trees around them. Most people barely looked at me. A few offered water. Some watched me the way people watch someone handling their expensive belongings. None of them asked who I used to be. I was grateful for that. Around that time, my sleep became deep for the first time in years. Exhaustion can do that. But it was not just the physical work. It was the absence of expectations. No one told me to fix a spreadsheet at midnight. No one asked me to make them look competent. No one erased my name from anything. There was nothing to erase. One afternoon, I was cleaning a house near the hospital when my phone buzzed. Not a call from my family. They had gone quiet. My dad did not check on me. Lydia did not send a single message. Mom texted once, a short line about hoping I was doing something productive. Then silence. I stayed with the cleaning company for almost a year. It was steady, predictable. I learned how to remove wine stains from marble. I learned how to fix streaks on stainless steel appliances. I learned that some people leave their lives in disarray and expect someone else to make it neat again. But the strangest part was this. Even while I scrubbed and polished and wiped, my mind still counted things. I would catch myself analyzing patterns in supply orders or predicting how. Often certain clients would cancel based on their past behavior. Numbers did not care that I was a cleaner now. They still spoke to me. The shift toward Julian began unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. I had been hired temporarily by a luxury staffing agency that provided cleaning services for high-profile clients during events or property transitions. The pay was better, mostly because the clients demanded spotless perfection. I remember the first night I stepped foot onto Julian Mercer's property. I did not know who he was, not really. I only knew the name on the schedule and the note that said, "Confidential, client. Large estate. Follow security instructions." The house was quiet inside, modern in a way that felt intentional rather than cold. I was assigned to the east hallway and the small office connected to it. My job was to wipe surfaces, replace a few items on the bookshelf, and polish the glass desk. While I was working, I heard a voice behind the partly open door, a man speaking Arabic into a phone. Clear, confidence, native-level fluency. I froze in place. It had been months since I heard anyone speak the language. Part of me missed it. Part of me feared it. Part of me felt something old wake up inside. I did not step closer. I did not say anything. It was none of my business. Still, I stood there with a glass cleaner in my hand, listening to a conversation about projections and timing. He said something about risk thresholds, something about regional volatility, something about the next quarter. I understood every word. My heart did something strange. Not a flutter. More like recognition. As if part of my life I thought was gone had suddenly tapped me on the shoulder. I heard him end the call. His footsteps moved farther down the hall. I exhaled. I had been holding my breath without realizing it. Later that night, as I walked back to my car, the air smelled like cut grass and late summer heat. I replayed parts of the conversation in my head. Not because of the content, because of the fluency, because someone in this city spoke a language I had buried. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at my hands. Cleaning had steadied them. Numbers had shaped them. But that night something else stirred, a bridge between who I used to be and who I had become. At the time, I did not know who the man on the phone really was. I did not know what role he would play. I only knew the sound of his voice in Arabic made something in me shift. A door is not fully open. Not yet. But it is no longer closed. A few evenings later, I was back at his place, wiping down the small pantry off the kitchen. It was lit close to the time when the whole house settled into that soft quiet where you can hear your own breath more clearly. I was reorganizing containers that had been shuffled around during the day, letting the rhythm of it clear my mind. Simple motions, simple results. No one watching. Julian had been on a call down the hall, speaking Arabic again. The tone of his voice was steady, clipped in places that told me he was tired, but still working. When the call clicked off, there was a few seconds of silence. Then I heard his footsteps, unhurried, moving in my direction. He stepped into the pantry doorway without announcing himself. That was normal. He rarely performed the little politeness rituals other wealthy clients liked to display. He just appeared where he needed to appear. He asked a question in Arabic. It was small, something about the schedule for the cleaning crew that week and whether the side hallway would stay clear while contractors moved equipment in the morning. He asked it the way he would ask anyone on staff. He called my name the way he always did at his place, the way someone calls a person they are used to depending on for clarity. I answered before I had time to think. In Arabic, a quick explanation about how the path would be open and which entrance they would plan to use. My tone was neutral. Automatic, the same way I might answer a question about where the disinfectant was stored. He went still, just for half a second. I could feel his attention change. Not suspicious, but sharpened. He repeated the question in a slightly different phrasing. People do that when they are testing what they think they heard. I responded again, also without thinking. Short, precise, no embellishment. He stepped a little closer, not invading the space, but marking the shift. Then he asked something unrelated to the crew, something about whether the pantry door had been sticking earlier in the day. Again, I answered without switching languages, describing the hinge and how the house tends to expand when the humidity rises. He did not interrupt. He just watched me with a kind of quiet calculation, like he was trying to understand a number that did not belong in the equation. After a moment, he said, in English this time, "Can I ask you something?" His voice was softer than usual, but not friendly, more like someone studying a puzzle. I kept cleaning because stopping would have made the moment too heavy. He gestured to the small clipboard on the counter near the fruit bins. The staff used it for notes about restocking and minor issues. He said he had been trying to get the team to write clearer notes for internal handoffs. He pointed to one written earlier that day. It was vague, written in incomplete sentences, and the meaning could have gone 3 different directions. He said he needed a cleaner version, something simple and precise, so the morning staff would not waste time guessing. Then he asked if I could rewrite it, just to make things clearer. I hesitated, not because I could not do it, but because I knew the risk of standing out even an inch. But he was not asking about market projections. He was not asking me to solve anything complicated. It was just a note, a few sentences, nothing that could reveal anything I did not want revealed. So I told him yes, as long as my name was not on it. He looked at me carefully then, as if the condition itself told him more than the answer would have. I rewrote the note. It took less than a minute. A simple explanation, a clear timeline, direct instructions, something anyone could understand without guessing. I placed the clipboard back on the counter. He scanned the note with a small nod. Not impressed. Not suspicious, just observing. I could tell he still did not know what to make of me, but he was too disciplined to show more. He said thank you, not casually, but deliberately. Then he left the pantry. When he was gone, I sat back on my heels for a moment, my hands still wearing thin cleaning gloves. I could hear him walking away down the hall. Slow, thoughtful, not concerned, just thinking. I told myself it did not matter, that rewiring a few sentences meant nothing, that answering a handful of questions in Arabic meant even less, that he was just being polite or curious or momentarily practical. But I knew better. People like Julian do not notice things without reason. They do not hear a language and file it away as coincidence. They do not watch reactions and forget them. What I did not know yet was how controlled his curiosity could be, how patient. How he would watch without intruding, how he would wait for patterns to repeat before forming a conclusion. At that point, though, he did not trust me, not even a little. He did not distrust me either. I was simply a new variable in his environment, one he needed to measure before deciding anything. I finished the pantry and gathered my supplies. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after a shift in the air. I walked through the hallway with my cleaning cart, and each wheel turned with that soft, rubbery sound that always reminded me of grocery stores late at night. At the end of the hallway, I paused, just long enough to steady my hands, not because I was shaken, but because something inside me felt too awake, too alert. As if a door that had stayed locked for years had clicked open a fraction. I stepped outside into the warm night air. It smelled like pine and the faint sweetness of the garden he kept on the west side of the property. I loaded my supplies into my car and sat for a moment before starting them. Engine. I knew what had happened in the pantry was small, barely worth noting. A handful of words exchanged in a language I had kept buried. A rewritten sentence on a clipboard. Nothing that should have mattered, and yet it did. It mattered because I had answered him without thinking, because Arabic had come back to me like muscle memory, because for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at me and seen something they could not categorize. I started the engine. The headlights lit up the gravel drive. As I pulled away, the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, its windows warm against the night. I drove toward home with a strange feeling that a quiet question had been asked, and a quiet answer had already been given, even if neither of us knew what it meant yet. That night I fell asleep quickly, but the sound of his voice in Arabic lingered, thread itself into the edge of my dreams, waiting for the next time it would surface. It did not take long. 2 days later, I returned to his place for an evening shift. The house was busier than usual. Someone was repairing a section of the downstairs flooring, and the staff was moving around with more purpose than normal. I kept to my assigned area, wiping surfaces, emptying bins, resetting things the way the lead housekeeper preferred. It was all ordinary enough that I almost convinced myself the moment in the world room pantry had meant nothing. But when I stepped into the small office off the east hallway, Julian was already standing near the desk with a folder open in front of him. He glanced up when he heard me, not startled, just aware. He said something polite in English, the kind of greeting people use when they acknowledge your existence but do not want to interrupt their own momentum. I nodded and stepped around him to reach the supply cart. Then he spoke in Arabic again, this time not on the phone. He asked about something simple near the door, whether the repair crew had blocked the side exit earlier. It felt like a nudge disguised as a question. I answered without emotion, the same way I had before. He did not smile. He did not frown. He just absorbed the answer, filed it away, and returned to his folder. That might have been the end of it. Except Omar walked in a minute later. His voice was soft, low-pitched, with the kind of accent that comes from someone who grew up speaking 3 languages at once. He greeted Julian, then noticed me and paused. His eyes flicked toward Julian as if asking a silent question. Julian answered something in Arabic. Not about me. Not really. It was more of a comment, an observation, and then a question directly for Omar, a small one about data entry timing for internal reports. Omar responded in Arabic, and the conversation moved casually along, until Julian asked a short question and looked toward me again. I knew what he was doing. He wanted to see if the pantry incident had been an accident or a skill. I answered. Again. Calm, accurate, precise. Omar still went the same way Julian had the first time. He studied me, not rudely, just long enough to decide whether what he heard could be trusted. Then he asked something else, this one more technical, about whether a shift in supply patterns would affect staffing loads. I recognized the question for what it was. A test. So I gave a test-level answer. Short, neutral, nothing beyond what anyone could observe by watching the flow of the house. He nodded once. That was all. I turned back to my cleaning cloth, wiping a corner of the desk that was already spotless. They kept talking behind me until they reached a point where Julian said he needed a clearer summary of their internal notes. That was when he looked at me again and motioned toward the small side table. There were 3 sheets of paper clipped together. The handwriting was inconsistent. Some notes were vague, others are contradictory. It was the kind of document that leads to people wasting a full morning trying to interpret something that was supposed to take 5 minutes. Julian said he wanted a distilled version. Just the essential points, nothing else. He added something about how evening staff sometimes noticed things that others missed. I hesitated again, but only for a moment. I told him I could rewrite them as long as he did not list me anywhere as the person who wrote them. He agreed without blinking. I took the papers to the pantry and sat on a stool, rewriting everything in my own pattern. Clear timeline, clear assumption, clear next steps. It was a page of simple logic, nothing special, just the kind of clarity I used to give my dad. I finished in a few minutes and brought it back to Julian. He scanned the page, then handed it to Omar. They looked at each other, not impressed, not frightened, not suspicious, just curious. That was the beginning. They did not trust me instantly. Men like Julian never do. Instead, they tested me the way investors test markets. Small pressure, small risks, small questions. A few nights later, I was refilling paper goods in the hallway closet when I heard my name spoken in Arabic. I walked toward the office, thinking I had misheard. But Julian was standing there with a spreadsheet on his laptop. He pointed to a column and asked something about the pattern he was seeing. The numbers were small. So small they hardly mattered. I answered anyway, explaining what could be causing the shift. He tried asking again from a slightly different angle. I gave the same explanation, the same tone, no embellishment. He nodded and kept working. That became a pattern. During cleaning shifts, he would ask little things, not important things, not high stakes, just small questions to understand whether what he saw was real or coincidence. Omar began checking behind him, verifying if my answers made sense. They were always careful, always quiet, always subtle. Most days I kept my routine. Clean countertops, dust shelves, replace towels, reset things so the morning staff did not have to. At night, when the house calmed, I sometimes wrote short notes on scrap paper about things that might matter to their internal processes. Never signed, never asked for. Just small corrections that saved people time. One evening, when I brought in a trash bag from the hallway, I saw Julian standing at the tall window staring at the lawn. He said something without turning, asking if I had noticed the pattern in the maintenance logs. A tiny inconsistency, one that meant almost nothing, but hinted at a potential supply delay. I answered with the most conservative interpretation. He glanced at me over his shoulder. Then he told Omar to model it both ways. No urgency, just curiosity. A few minutes later, he asked if I wanted to see something. He did not wait for a reply. He placed a small printed sheet on the table. It was a list of trial positions, tiny amounts of money used to test hypotheses. He pointed to one line item and said he was considering shifting it for timing reasons. Then he asked what I thought. I almost laughed, not out of joy, out of disbelief. I had spent years being invisible, and now someone was asking my opinion about something he could lose without noticing. That was the key. This was money he could afford to lose, not a real investment, a harmless experiment. So I told him the truth, that the timing looked off by a few days because of a subtle pricing lag that usually preceded a predictable adjustment. Omar listened closely. He wrote something down. Then he asked me why I said that. I gave a short explanation. He nodded slowly. Julian studied me like I was a puzzle he had not decided to solve yet. 2 weeks passed before he tested it. He adjusted the position. A small shift, barely noticeable. A piece of money so insignificant to him it might as well have been the cost of lunch. But the result proved the timing issue. The number moved exactly the way I said it would. Not dramatically, just enough to confirm I had not guessed. The next time I arrived for my shift, there was nothing said directly. No praise, no comment. But there was a difference. He asked fewer testing questions and more genuine ones. Omar stopped rephrasing everything twice. They still did not know who I was. They still did not trust me fully. But they no longer saw me as a cleaner who coincidentally spoke Arabic. They saw me as something in between. A variable worth measuring. A voice worth checking. It was a strange space to exist in, half invisible, half observed. I had lived in worse. The more nights I spent there, the more the pattern settled into place. Daytime was cleaning, resetting, organizing. Nighttime was small notes written in the margins of their internal documents, quiet clarifications, observations no one else caught. Nothing official, nothing with my name on it. I kept boundaries sharp. I never entered their offices unless asked. I never volunteered information. I never hinted at anything beyond what was visible. Sometimes, when I drove home past midnight, the city lights blurred against the windshield, and I felt a calm I had not felt in years. It was not pride. It was not valid. It was something simpler. Someone had listened. Not fully, not deeply, not completely, but enough to prove I was not imagining my own mind. One night, as I left his place, the air was cool for the first time that season. Leaves scraped softly across the driveway. When I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door. I felt the shift again. Quiet. Slow. Certain. Not trust. Not yet. But possibility. I drove home with that possibility sitting in the passenger seat, like an uninvited guest. I did not push it away. I just let it ride along with me in silence, waiting for whatever would come next. Lydia dragged her fingernail across the rim of her wine glass so slowly it made a thin, sharp sound, like something tightening in the air. She did not look at me. She did not have to. I felt the shift happen in her before she even spoke, but the words did not come. Not yet, because what happened next did not belong to her. It began behind me, in the kitchen doorway, with a voice that had never before existed inside my parents' home. Julian said my name. Not in English. Not gently. Not with caution. He said it the exact way he always did at his place, in that clipped, focused tone he used when he needed clarity. Then he followed it with a question in Arabic. A real question, one he had clearly carried with him all day, still turning in his mind even as he sat in someone else's holiday dining room. For a full second, my body forgot where I was. My hands were covered in dishwater. I was holding a damp towel. My family was behind me in the dining room. But the moment his voice touched the air, I was back in that hallway, back beside the glass desk, back in the calm rhythm of answering without thinking. So I did what I always did. I answered him, in Arabic. Quietly, directly, reflexively. The words left my mouth before I had time to remember they did not belong. Here, in this house, in this kitchen, within reach of these people who believed they had already defined me. The entire room went still. Even the forks stopped scraping plates. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Someone set down a glass too hard, and it made a dull knock against the table. But no one reacted faster than Lydia. She turned her head so sharply I heard the earrings she wore brush against her hair. Her expression did not match anything I had seen from her before. Not mockery, not irritation. Something closer to calculation. Like she had just watched the ground under her shift a fraction of an inch, and was scrambling to decide if it was safe to step forward. My mom's hand froze around her napkin. My dad frowned. Not in confusion, but in the way someone frowns when they see something they cannot immediately categorize. He did not say my name. He didn't ask what had been said. He simply stared at me as though I had malfunctioned in front of him. But the strangest reaction came from the guests. A few of them glanced toward the kitchen, then toward each other, polite confusion flickering across their faces. They recognized Arabic. They did not recognize it coming from me. I felt the shift ripple outward like a quiet shockwave. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise enough to hit every person in that dining room. Julian stepped fully into the kitchen then, as if only just realizing what he had done. His posture changed slightly, not embarrassed, not defensive, just aware. He looked directly at me, not past me the way my family often did. He asked a second question in English this time, softer, as if giving me a chance to reorient. But the damage was already done. His presence had rewritten the air. The kitchen felt smaller. The house felt colder. My role felt suddenly unstable, as if I were standing on a platform that had been supported only by their assumptions, and someone had finally kicked the first support beam out from under it. Behind me, I heard someone at the table whisper something under their breath. A soft, "What was that?" followed by a quick hush. My mom stood halfway from her chair before sitting back down, unsure of the correct reaction. My dad cleared his throat once, long and low, preparing himself to regain control of a room he had built entirely on hierarchy and predictability. Julian did not seem to notice any of that. Or maybe he did. Maybe he noticed everything, but he did not apologize for speaking to me. He did not explain why he had done it. He simply asked his question again, the way someone does when the conversation is far more important to them than the environment around it. This time I answered him in English. His eyes flickered just slightly with recognition. Not of me exactly, but of the adjustment I had made. The awareness that I understood context well enough to shift languages when needed. It was the kind of recognition that had nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with competence. A kind of recognition my family had never offered me. I saw Lydia's jaw tighten as she watched him speak to me. Not flirtation, not interest, not warmth, just the simple act of addressing me as if my mind existed. She could not stand that. I stepped slightly to the side to give him room near the counter. He moved as if he belonged there, completely unconscious of the tension he had ignited. He rested a hand on the edge of the counter while waiting for my response. The same casual position he used at his place. Familiar. Automatic. The way someone positions themselves around a person they are used to. Consulting. He had forgotten where we were. That was the truth of it. He had forgotten that in this house I was not the quiet person who rewrote notes and clarified patterns. I was the girl my dad had announced did not deserve a seat at the table. The girl my mom said was worth nothing. The cleaner Lydia sneered at. He had forgotten. But my family did not. And the silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to bend the edges of the workroom. A waiter leaned in to refill a guest's glass and froze when he sensed the tension. Two cousins who had been laughing earlier went silent. Someone dropped a piece of silverware, and the clatter was louder than it should have been. Then I heard a slow exhale from the dining room. Not mine, Lydia's. It was the sound she made when she realized a story she had spent years constructing had just sprung a leak. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. Or worse, a survivor. My dad finally forced out a brittle laugh, the kind used to dismiss something you do not want to understand. He said something meant to minimize the moment, but his voice lacked conviction. My mom's smile was tight and thin, already cracking around the edges, but nothing they did could change the fact that the room had seen it, heard it, felt the shift. I placed the towel down and stepped back because there was nowhere to move. That did not feel like retreat. Julian noticed the tension then. Truly noticed it, and a subtle crease appeared between his brows. He looked from me to the dining room, then back again, putting pieces together with an efficiency that made my stomach tighten. He said something gentle, quiet enough that only I heard it. A small apology for interrupting my work, for pulling me into something I had not asked for. I nodded once, but the dining room was still watching. All of them. Every single person. I heard my name again, this time not from Julian, but from the table. Lydia's voice, sharp, controlled. Too controlled. She called my name like a warning. I turned toward her slowly. Her expression was not anger, not confusion. It was fear. Small, subtle, quickly hidden, but real. She was afraid not because she understood the language spoken, but because she understood the imbalance it created. Something had tilted in a way she did not approve of. Something had slipped beyond her control. The kind of fear that comes when a crack forms in a story you have been telling for too long. I stood there in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, Julian behind me, my family in front of me. And for the first time since I had walked into that house tonight, I felt an old part of myself return. Not pride, not triumph. Recognition of who I used to be, of who I had been forced to become, of who they had pretended I was. The room remained silent long enough that even the candles seemed to burn, louder. Then Lydia spoke again, her voice thinner now, strangled by the sudden need to regain control. She asked me something pointless, something she already knew the answer to. just to reestablish the hierarchy. But the attempt was too late. Julie Vane watched her with the same calm interest he used when reading a chart that did not quite align, and Lydia, for the first time in her life, looked unsure of her footing. I held her gaze for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to see the precise instant she realized something had shifted in a way she could not name. That was where the night changed course. And that was where I stood, suspended between two versions of myself, listening to the quiet unraveling of a story that had never been true in the first place. Lydia's face was still tight with that thin, stretched fear when the air in the dining room shifted again, as if the whole house took a breath it did not want to release. I stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, trying to steady myself, when Julian spoke behind me in a level tone that carried farther than he probably intended. He said he would return to the table. Not suggested, not asked, stated. He moved past me without touching me, but the distance between us felt charged, like static on the edge of a storm that had been building long before either of us stepped into this house. I followed a few steps behind, not because I wanted to be anywhere near that table, but because the room felt locked around me, and retreating was impossible without creating more spectacle. Julian stepped back into the dining room with a calm authority that did not match the chaos he had inadvertently created. Conversations that had tried to sputter back to life died instantly. People straightened in their chairs. Someone set down a fork in slow motion. My dad cleared his throat in that way he always did when he felt control slipping. He forced a smile and started to say something about too much wine and holiday excitement. But Julian did not give him the chance. He placed his hand lightly on the back of his own chair, looked directly at my dad, and said something no one at that table expected to hear. She has been working with me for years. The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like the sound had been sucked out of the air. My mom blinked, twice. Lydia's mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again, as if her mind could not compute what she had just heard. My dad sat back, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowing not in confusion, but in disbelief that someone dared introduce a story he did not script. I stayed near the doorway of the kitchen, unable to move forward and unwilling to step back. Julian spoke again, this time with the patient clarity of someone accustomed to explaining complex things to people who misinterpret the obvious. He said my name. Then he said I had been supporting his internal assessments and logistics processes for a significant period of time. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He did not look to me for confirmation. He made a statement of fact. Omar, who had been sitting near the middle of the table, nodded once. A small gesture, but it sliced through the disbelief like a blade. People looked at him because he had that presence. The silent advisor, whose endorsement carried weight, even without a title, displayed on his chest. My mom's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. My dad leaned forward slightly and asked in a strained voice if Julian meant, "She helps with your cleaning staff." It sounded desperate, thin, like someone trying to shove an entire collapsing structure back into place. Julian shook his head. "No, not cleaning," he said. "Analysis work, internal planning, risk interpretation." The silence deepened. Someone coughed quietly. A guest at the far end put down their silverware with a small clink. Lydia stared at me as if I were a stranger who had walked into her home, wearing her clothes. Julian continued, still calm. He explained what he meant. Not fully. Never fully. But enough. Enough that the room understood my role had been more than wiping down surfaces and replacing towels. Enough that they grasped the implication that he trusted my judgment. Enough that they realized I had been functioning in a space none of them knew existed. Then he mentioned something that pulled the last bit of breath from the room. He said I had identified early signals in the 2024 market movements, signals he had initially dismissed because they came from an unexpected source. A small smile flickered at the edges of his mouth. Not amusement, but the faint recognition of hindsight. He said he had tested my interpretation using money he could afford to lose. A trivial amount for him, but enough to verify accuracy. Enough to confirm he should listen. He said I had been right. My dad shifted in his seat, discomfort rippling through him like a tremor. He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something colder, a realization that he had underestimated someone he had assumed was beneath him. My mom's lips pressed together so tightly they went white. Her gaze darted between me and Julian, then landed on her plate. Lydia did not move at all. Her posture was rigid, her eyes bright with a kind of disbelief that bordered on terror. Julian let the silence stretch before he added something almost casual. I asked her because she sees patterns quickly, unusually quickly. He said it the way someone mentions a skill they rely on, not a compliment, not a performance. Just a fact. Then came the moment that split the night open. Julian turned fully toward my dad. His expression did not change. His tone did not sharpen. He simply asked a question. Did she warn you too? My dad froze. He did not blink. He did not breathe for a second. He just stared at Julian, as if the question itself was an accusation, because it was. It was not about markets. It was about all the times I had tried to tell him something he did not want to hear. All the times I had placed data in front of him that he had ignored. All the times I had spoken with clarity only to be dismissed because of the words came from me. Dad swallowed once, hard. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The muscles in his jaw shifted as he searched for a version of the truth that would not make him look careless, or petty, or foolish. There was none. My mom looked at him, her face tight with the kind of pressure people feel when they know their partner has walked into a trap they set for themselves. But she did not rescue him. She stayed silent. Lydia tried to speak, but her voice cracked on the first word. She covered it with a cough, but the damage was done. Everyone heard it. Omar, who rarely spoke in public settings, looked directly at my dad and confirmed that the signals I identified aligned with early discussions in their internal strategy team. That was not entirely true. I had been the one who first mentioned them, but his phrasing was intentional. He was giving Julian the weight of corroboration, but also giving me cover, a courtesy I did not expect. My dad finally found his voice. It came out low, defensive. He said something about not recalling specifics, about how the timing had been unclear, about not wanting to take unnecessary risks during a period of instability. His words stumbled. They contradicted each other. He sounded like a man trying to build a staircase while falling down it. Julian did not respond to the excuse. He simply tilted his head and studied him. That quiet, analytical stare was more devastating than any accusation, because silence forces truth to stand alone. My dad's gaze flicked toward me. For the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. He did not understand me. Not even a little. He had built an entire narrative of who I was, and now a stranger had stepped into his home and cracked it open with 2 sentences. My mom finally spoke. A soft, brittle sound. She said she had never heard me talk about markets or analysis work before. It was meant to be a dig, but it came out hollow. Someone at the far end of the table muttered something like, "Clearly you should have." It was quiet, but not quiet enough. My dad stiffened. Lydia whispered something to herself, too low for anyone else to hear. Her fingers trembled when she lifted her glass. Julian did something subtle then. He looked toward me again, not for confirmation, not for support, just acknowledgement, as if he were mentally repositioning me into the correct category. Not a servant, not an employee, not a ghost. Competent person, a category my family had never once allowed me to occupy. The dining room stayed suspended in that unbearable quiet, every emotion raw and exposed on the table, next to the untouched dinner plates. My dad tried to pull himself together. He straightened his jacket. He forced his breathing to slow. He attempted a smile that failed halfway. But what he did not realize was that a single question had already undone him. Did she warn you too? He could not answer it honestly without admitting he had dismissed me. He could not lie without making himself look foolish in front of powerful guests. He was trapped between pride and truth. And for the first time in my life, I was not the one cornered. The tension grew sharper, pressing against the walls, pressing against the people, pressing against the story my family had spent years manufacturing. And that was where the night balanced itself. Right at the moment before someone finally said what could not be unsaid, a chair scraped lightly against the floor. Not dramatically, not loud, just enough for everyone to hear it. It came from the left side of the table, where the clients and guests my dad had invited were seated. These were not people who came for family bonding. They were there because my dad wanted to impress them, because Ward Logistics needed them, because these dinners were his stage and his leverage. The man who moved his chair was Gregory Shaw, a contract attorney who specialized in transportation law. Tall, quiet, with the kind of calm expression that made everything he said sound like a formal decision. He was not family. He had no interest in family drama, but he had been listening. He leaned slightly toward the woman sitting next to him. She was one of the potential partners for a major agreement my dad had been chasing for months. I saw Gregory whisper something to her. A few whispered words, nothing more. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then her face tightened with the kind of thoughtful caution people get when they hear information they cannot ignore. My dad noticed. Of course he did. He leaned forward, smiling in that way he reserved for maintaining control of a room. But Gregory did not return the smile. Instead, he said something in a low voice that everyone around him could still hear. He mentioned concern about a liability clause in the contract Ward Logistics was negotiating. He did not state it as a criticism. He stated it as an observation. A quiet one, precise. The kind that changes the shape of a room without raising its volume. I felt the air shift again. A ripple that went through the guests first, then spread to the family, then reached the edges of the house itself. My dad stiffened. He forced a light laugh, attempting to turn the comment playful, but Gregory continued, his tone steady. He said he had noticed inconsistencies in the proposal presented earlier that month. Things that did not match the public projections. Things that made the contract look riskier than advertised. I closed my eyes for half a second because I knew exactly which inconsistencies he meant. I had flagged them 3 months earlier in a report I had written in plain language so my dad and Lydia could not misunderstand. They nodded politely. Nodding was their version of listening. Nodding was how they pretended my work mattered before discarding it. My father tried to redirect the conversation toward positive metrics. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, a habit he had when he needed to appear confident. But Gregory did not interrupt him. He simply waited until my dad finished, then quietly asked if the internal analysis had been updated since the new market conditions began forming in mid-year 2024. Silence. The kind of silence that signals an answer without requiring anyone to speak. My mom looked down at her plate. Not out of embarrassment, out of resignation. She knew my dad had not updated anything. He had never updated anything without someone pushing him, and I had stopped pushing long before leaving the company. One of the younger associates at the far end of the table shifted, uncomfortably. Beside him, the potential partner cleared her throat and folded her napkin slowly, the way people do when they decide to step away from a conversation before it becomes a liability. She said she needed to excuse herself for a moment. Her tone was polite, but the meaning was razor sharp. She was withdrawing, not loudly, not angrily, just withdrawing her presence. The same way investors quietly remove themselves from a deal they no longer bring trust. My dad watched her stand. His smile faltered, then it disappeared entirely. Gregory took a sip of his water, calm, detached. He did not intend to embarrass anyone. He was simply unwilling to ignore legal risk. That was his job. It had always been his job, and tonight he had done it openly. Because the moment Julian questioned my dad, the illusion of authority at that table had already cracked. Lydia leaned forward, her voice too bright as she tried to reassure the guests. She said the company had conducted recent reviews and everything was aligned with current market conditions. It was the kind of vague statement people make when they hope no one asks for proof. Gregory asked for proof. He asked if the review had included cross-referencing the supply chain, disruptions flagged in early quarter. He asked if the rate adjustments had been recalculated based on the revised projections. Then he paused, looked briefly toward me, and said something that landed like a stone in water. Because if she noticed it, he said, others have too. It was not praise. It was not valid. It was truth spoken without an agenda, and it struck the table with the quiet force of inevitability. My dad opened his mouth twice before any sound came out. Finally, he said the review was ongoing, not complete, not finalized, just ongoing. His voice quivered around the edges. The potential partner did not sit back down. Instead, she stepped aside and began speaking softly with another guest, someone who had arrived with her. Their faces shifted from interest to caution, then from caution to distance. Then they both walked toward the foyer in polite retreat. People do not need to declare their decisions out loud. Some decisions are made in the simple act of not returning to the table. When people stop nodding, they are already leaving. That was the first moment I watched my dad feel the consequences of ignoring something that had been placed directly in front of him. Not punishment, not collapse, just consequence. Cold, quiet, precise. The kind of karma that does not require anger to be effective. The room had changed. The energy had changed. The story my family had been selling for years no longer held its shape. Without the constant nodding of guests, without the practiced admiration, without the performance of success, the truth sat plainly on the table. Ward logistics did not crumble. No one shouted. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing. But the loss of image was immediate and irreversible. For people like my dad and Lydia, image was currency. Reputation was leverage. Tonight, both slipped out from under them in silence. My mom leaned back slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as if grounding herself. She did not look at me. She did not look at my dad. She looked at the empty seats where the partners had been sitting. That was where the damage was. Not in public humiliation, not in family conflict. In the subtle shift of external perception, people at the table began watching my dad with a new kind of caution, the kind people use when evaluating whether someone is still worth aligning with. The kind that tells you power is starting to leak from the edges. My dad's face turned a shade paler. He wiped his forehead with his napkin. He asked if anyone wanted dessert. No one answered. I stayed in the doorway, still half in the kitchen, my hands resting against the frame. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not comfort anyone. For the first time in my life, I was not being asked to fix anything. Lydia glanced toward me again, her expression rigid, her eyes bright with something sharp and defensive. She knew the shift was connected to the moment Julian asked that question. She knew the silence afterward had not been in my dad's favor. And she knew the legal concern Gregory raised was something I had mentioned months before. She had dismissed it then, just as my dad had. Now someone with authority had validated the exact risk I had pointed to. The room did not know the details. They did not need to. All they needed to see was the pattern. They were seeing it now. Julian remained completely neutral, neither participating in the unraveling nor interfering. He simply observed, as if watching the predictable outcome of an equation he had already solved. Omar watched quietly too, his expression unreadable. But he understood the implications. He understood how fragile reputation can be when built on unexamined assumptions. Someone at the table tried to restart a conversation about holiday plans, but the words fell flat. No one was engaged. No one laughed. No one seemed able to pretend anymore. That was the moment I realized something important. My family was not falling apart. They were being seen accurately. There is a difference. They were losing the one thing they valued more than love or loyalty or truth. They were losing the belief that other people admired them. Image. That had always been their currency. And tonight, the value of that currency dropped sharply. Karma does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks into a room, takes a seat, and waits for everyone to notice the shift in temperature. I stood quietly, letting the weight settle. Julie Vane glanced at me once, subtle, almost unintentional. I did not look away. I held the moment as still as I could because something inside me knew this was not the climax. It was the preface. The beginning of the unraveling. The first crack in a structure that had been carefully maintained for years. And as the room fell into uneasy silence, with half-eaten plates and untouched dessert menus, I felt the next turn in the story leaning in. Some truths do not stay hidden forever. And tonight, the room had finally stopped nodding. I stayed near the kitchen doorway long after the table fell silent. No one told me to leave. No one told me to stay. People avoided looking at me, the way you avoid looking directly at something that forces you to confront yourself. It would have been easier if someone yelled. Anger I could handle, but this quiet unraveling, This collective discomfort was heavier than any insult my family had ever thrown. When the guests finally began pushing their chairs back, murmuring excuses about early mornings and travel plans, I moved aside to clear space for them. Someone touched my arm gently in passing and whispered something kind that I did not quite register. I was too focused on the way my dad rose from his seat, jaw clenched, eyes darting from person to person as if trying to calculate how much damage had been done. He did not come toward me immediately. Instead, he walked to the foyer with one of the partners who had stayed behind just below, long enough to avoid being rude. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Short nods, tight smiles, a handshake that was too quick. Then the man stepped out the door and did not look back. My mom stood frozen at the edge of the dining room. Lydia stayed seated, staring at her empty plate as if she expected it to give her instructions. When the last guest left, my dad finally spoke my name. He did not shout it. He said it softly, which somehow felt worse. He asked me to follow him. My mom and Lydia came too. No one discussed where we were going. It was automatic, the same way we had always handled conflict. Privately, behind closed doors, never in front of outsiders. He led us into the small sitting room near the staircase. The door clicked shut behind us. My dad stood with his hands on his hips, breathing slowly, like he was preparing for a confrontation he was not sure how to begin. My mom took the love seat. Lydia perched on the arm of a chair, elbows tucked in, shoulders tense. I stood near the window. Distance felt necessary. My dad cleared his throat. I waited. He finally said he did not understand why I had not told them everything earlier. His voice hovered between disappointment and accusation. He said it like I had betrayed the family by withholding something important, as if he had ever wanted to know anything I was capable of. I reminded him that I had told him, over and over, not about Julian, but about the signals, the patterns, the inconsistencies, the same things he had dismissed because they did not come from the daughter he valued. He shook his head, already rejecting the memory. He accused me of twisting things, of making him look foolish in front of people he respected. He said I should have given him clarity. I told him he never wanted clarity. He wanted confirmation. Those are not the same thing. My mom leaned forward, her voice softer than his but no less pointed. She said families need to rely on each other. She said trust was important. She said it as if she were the one who had been betrayed. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was surreal. I told her I had relied on them for years. I had trusted them. I had given them every opportunity to see me. And they had chosen not to. She flinched at that, barely, but enough for me to notice. Then Lydia spoke. Her tone was sharp, brittle around the edges, like a glass about to crack. She said I had embarrassed them. She said I had used tonight to make a scene. She said this was all intentional, calculated, designed to hurt her and the company. I asked her why she thought everything revolved around her. I asked her if she genuinely believed I had orchestrated Julian speaking to me in Arabic. I asked if she truly imagined I could control the reactions of their own guests. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She had no answer. My dad stepped between us before she could regain her voice. He said he needed me to be reasonable. That was his favorite word, reasonable. He used it whenever he wanted someone to agree with him without questioning. He said I should consider coming back to the company. He said we could reset things, that the family needed unity, that public perception mattered, now more than ever. He used phrases like move forward and rebuild and support one another. He did not use the word apology, not once. I asked him why he wanted me back. He said I had skills they could use, not skills he respected, not skills he had nurtured, skills they could use. A tool, not a daughter. I let the silence sit between us, heavy, honest. Then I said something I had never said out loud before. I told him he had never once asked what I wanted. Not my entire life. I told him that every role I had ever played in this family was one he assigned to me. The quiet daughter, the convenient worker, the background presence. I told him I was done being something he used only when it benefited him. He looked stunned. Not angry, not insulted, just stunned, as if he genuinely never considered I might have desires separate from his expectations. My mom stood and walked toward me, her expression torn between hurt and pleading. She said I was being dramatic. She said families fight. She said no one meant anything cruel. I reminded her of her own words from earlier that night, that I was worth nothing. I asked her when she planned to take that back. Her face went blank. She said she was frustrated, and that I should not cling to things said in the heat of the moment, as if insults lose their poison once the moment passes. Lydia crossed her arms and muttered that I was being ungrateful. I almost thanked her. She had always been predictable. Predictability made this easier. My dad finally lowered his voice and said he needed to understand whether I was willing to come back as part of the team, because tonight had made things complicated with the partners. He said I had put them in a difficult position. He said a lot of things, none of which were about me as a human being. I told him no. Not loudly, not emotionally, just no. His jaw tightened again. He asked me to think carefully. He said this decision could cost me my relationship with the family. There it was. The threat. Quiet, familiar. A blade disguised as concern. I told him that the relationship had already cost me more than they would ever understand. I told him I had spent years erasing myself to make them comfortable. Years shrinking so they could feel big. Years giving them credit they never earned. I said I was done paying that price. He stepped back as if I had struck him. My mom covered her mouth. Lydia whispered something harsh I did not catch. I looked at all three of them. My family. People I had once tried desperately to please. People I had once believed I needed. I realized then that walking away was not about revenge or proving something. It was about refusing to stay in a life that demanded I disappear. I told my dad I hoped the company recovered. I told my mom I hoped she found peace. I told Lydia nothing. She would not have heard it anyway. Then I walked to the door. My dad called my name once. Not tenderly, not angrily, just a raw sound, heavy with disbelief that I would actually leave. I kept walking. The hallway felt longer than usual, as if the house wanted one last chance to pull me back. The smell of holiday spices lingered in the air. Candles flickered in the foyer. My coat hung neatly on the rack where I had placed it when the night was still, young and predictable. I put it on without rushing. When I opened the front door, the cold air hit me full in the face. The driveway was quiet. The neighborhood was still. I heard laughter from a house across the street. Real laughter. Uncomplicated. I stepped outside and let the door close behind me. Not once did I turn around. Not once did I look back at the house where I had spent so many years trying to be seen. The night air was sharp as I walked toward my car. My breath fogged lightly in front of me, for the first time in a long time. The weight on my chest felt like it belonged to the past, not the present. And that was the moment I understood what walking away would cost me. Everything I once believed I needed, and nothing I needed now. I drove home that night with the heat on high and the radio off. Some moments are too loud for music. The road from my parents' house back to Charlotte felt longer than usual. And the lights along Providence Road blurred slightly, not from tears, but from a kind of sensory fatigue. It had been years since I allowed myself to imagine leaving them behind. Now that I had, the air in the car felt strangely clean. When I pulled into my apartment lot, I sat for a minute with my hands still on the wheel. The building lights reflected off the windshield. Nothing dramatic happened. No revelation. Just a quiet understanding that my life had shifted in a way that would not reverse. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. My body felt heavy, but my mind was startlingly clear. I made coffee and stood by the window while the sun lifted through the trees. This was my new beginning. Not loud, not triumphant. Real. Julian called around 9. He rarely called early unless something mattered. His voice had the usual calm confidence, but it held an undercurrent I had not heard before. Something close to concern. He asked if I was all right. Not professionally, personally. I told him I was fine. It was partly true. He said he wanted me in his office that afternoon. There were things he wanted to discuss. His tone told me it was more than work. When I arrived, Omar was already waiting. He gave me a nod that felt less like a greeting and more like an acknowledgement of what he had witnessed the night before. Julian motioned for me to sit. The room was bright with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It felt too open for the heaviness I carried inside. Julian took his seat opposite me. He studied me for a moment, the way he had the first time he realized my notes were not luck. Then he asked if I wanted time off. I almost laughed, not because the idea was ridiculous, but because it was unexpectedly kind. I told him I did not need time. I needed direction, something to move toward. He nodded once. Then he told me about a new project he wanted me to lead. Not assist, lead. A long-term analysis initiative focused on the energy markets. He said he trusted my instincts more than almost anyone he had worked with. For a moment, I could not speak. Not because I doubted myself, but because no one in my life had ever said something like that without an agenda tied to it. I accepted. Calmly. Quietly, the way I handled everything important. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. My days were filled with spreadsheets, small strategy sessions, long discussions with Julian and Omar, quiet hours spent reading market indicators, and unexpected pockets of satisfaction. I was working at my full capacity again, not half speed, not hidden, not waiting for permission that would never come. The nights were different. Some evenings I felt relief. Others felt hollow. Even when you walk away by choice, there is a kind of mourning that settles in the bones. A family is not easily discarded, even when they have spent years discarding you. People in Julian's circle began treating me differently too. Respect where there had once been dismissal. Curiosity where there had once been indifference. A few asked polite questions about Christmas dinner, but I learned quickly that the business world has a quiet way of spreading information without needing to repeat it out loud. Ward logistics did not collapse. I did not expect it to. Families like mine rarely fall in dramatic ways. They erode. Slowly. Quietly. Without headlines. Partners began hesitating, not refusing, hesitating. Meetings were postponed. Contracts took longer to finalize. Questions were asked about leadership stability and internal communication. Nothing that would ruin them. Everything that would remind them they were not untouchable. My dad tried calling twice in the first month. I did not answer. He sent a message asking if I would consider having dinner. He said we should clear the air. He did not mention an apology. My mom sent a shorter message a week later. She said she hoped I was eating well. That was all. No acknowledgement. No humility. Just a sentence that sounded like habit rather than love. Lydia never reached out. I did not respond to any of them. Spring arrived earlier that year. Charlotte bloomed in soft pastels. I moved into a new apartment closer to downtown. Nothing extravagant, but full of light. I bought new dishes, new towels, and small things that marked a fresh start. I took long walks on weekends, letting myself enjoy the quiet. It felt like learning to breathe again after years of shallow air. One afternoon in early April, Julian invited me to join him on a flight to Houston for a meeting with potential partners. He said he wanted them to hear from the person behind the analysis, not the assistant, not the anonymous hand, the person. On the plane, he looked at me with a thoughtful expression and said he had not expected them, Christmas dinner, to unfold the way it did. He said he had sensed tension in my family, but did not understand the depth of it until that night. I told him I was not embarrassed. Not anymore. He said he knew. Then he said something I did not expect. He said that sometimes the only way people learn who you are is when you stop. Trying to make yourself small. I sat with that for a long time. The meeting in Houston went well. They asked sharp questions. I answered all of them with clarity. One of the men at the table nodded slowly halfway through and said something that stayed with me. He said I had a way of explaining complicated things without making people feel dumb. The compliment was simple. It meant more than he knew. On the flight back, Julian told me he wanted to expand my role. He said he saw a future for me beyond advisory work. He said he thought I had leadership in me. Real leadership. The kind that could build something lasting. I did not answer right away. I let the words settle. They felt like a new language, one I was finally ready to learn. In May, I attended a conference in New York with Julian. It was the kind of event my dad had always chased invitations for. Large panels, polished speakers, private dinners where deals were hinted at through long pauses and carefully chosen phrasing. People greeted Julian warmly. A few recognized me from articles mentioning his team. My name was printed in the program booklet, first and last. That small detail felt like a quiet victory. On the second night, a woman from a major firm approached me and said she admired my work. She said she wished she had taken a similar path. I almost corrected her, almost told her my path was far from smooth, but I stopped myself. My story no longer needed their disbelief to be valid. June brought more projects, more meetings, more rhythm, and then, without warning, another message from my dad. He said he was proud of me. He said he wanted to talk. He said the company was reorganizing and he would like my perspective. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I was tempted, but because it revealed exactly what I already knew. Nothing had changed. They still saw my value only when it served them. I deleted it. By August, the distance no longer hurt. The grief had softened. The resentment had faded. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I no longer needed anger to protect myself. I had built something real, something earned, something independent of their permission. That was the revenge I never planned. The kind that did not require cruelty or confrontation. Just the truth. Truth lived out loud. One day in early September, I stood in Julian's office by the window while he reviewed a report I had finished. He set it down and said my work had strengthened the company in ways I probably did not realize. Then he said he was glad I had walked into his house years ago as a cleaner. He said it with the kind of sincerity that leaves no room for misinterpretation. I told him I was glad too. And I meant it, because that job had not been a failure. It had been a doorway, a small, unexpected doorway into the life I should have always been allowed to live. This morning, I sat in my new kitchen with a cup of coffee and watched the city wake up. The light hit the buildings in a way that made them look softer, almost forgiving. I thought about the girl I used to be, quiet, careful, constantly shrinking so others could feel comfortable. I felt something like gratitude for her. She kept me alive long enough to become someone else. My family still goes to the same holiday events. I see pictures sometimes. Lydia in her perfect dresses. My mom smiled without smiling. My dad shakes hands with the same confidence that has begun to crack around the edges. No one mentions me. That used to sting. Now, it feels like relief. My value exists whether they acknowledge it or not. My worth does not disappear because they refuse to see it. Some things shine whether or not someone points a spotlight at them. I have learned that the revenge that lasts is not humiliation or exposure. It is becoming the person you were never allowed to be and living that truth without apology. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.